"Someone get him off the stage, he's embarrassing us," the CEO barked into the microphone, while the audience howled with laughter. They didn't just ignore him, they humiliated him, reducing a professional man to a public spectacle because of the color of his skin. No warning, no mercy, no shame. In front of hundreds, his dignity was ripped away like it had never existed, while the executives he had once called colleagues sat back and watched, some smirking, some pretending not to see. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply gathered the scattered papers from the floor, lifted his chin, and walked off that stage like a soldier retreating from a battlefield already marked for revenge. What no one realized was that the man they mocked was about to engineer a takeover so devastating it would leave their empire in ashes, and their names forgotten. Before we reveal how everything unraveled, be sure to like this video, subscribe for more real stories of justice and redemption, and comment below. What do you think is coming next, and where are you watching from? Stay locked in. The real story is just getting started. Ethan King was the kind of employee who slipped through the cracks of a busy corporate world, not because he lacked skill, but because he carried himself with a quiet humility that made others overlook his presence. On the surface, the company he worked for, Whitmore Technologies, prided itself on being inclusive and forward-thinking. They flaunted diversity metrics on glossy brochures, smiled for press photos with token hires, and made grand statements about equality at quarterly town halls. But behind the glass walls and designer furniture, the truth was as ugly as it was old. If you didn't fit the mold, you didn't belong. Ethan knew this without anyone having to say it out loud. It was there in the subtle glances, the way meetings would start without him, how emails somehow missed his inbox when crucial decisions were made. From the very first day, he had felt the unspoken rule press against him like a heavy, invisible hand. You can stay, as long as you know your place. It was in the little things first. Brad Whitmore, the son of the founder and now CEO, never remembered Ethan's name despite working on the same floor for 5 years. In meetings, Brad would greet the room with enthusiastic handshakes and grins, except when it came to Ethan, where the greeting was a half-hearted nod, if that. Colleagues who joined after Ethan quickly leapfrogged him for promotions, earning shiny new titles and fat bonuses, while he remained tethered to the same mid-level analyst role, expected to smile and applaud their success. At company parties, the division was even more stark. Ethan would often find himself standing awkwardly near the buffet table, holding a glass of sparkling water, while Brad and his clique laughed boisterously at private jokes only they understood. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't violence. It was worse, a surgical casual exclusion, so deeply embedded it almost seemed polite. One Friday evening, Whitmore Technologies held a lavish annual gala at the prestigious Skyline Hotel. Employees were instructed to dress in formal attire for an evening of appreciation and recognition. Ethan arrived in a crisp navy suit, shoes polished to a mirror shine, his tie perfectly knotted. He felt a flicker of hope as he entered the glittering ballroom, thinking perhaps tonight would be different. Maybe tonight he'd be seen. Maybe tonight his years of dedication would finally be acknowledged. As he made his way through the crowd, careful not to bump into anyone, he spotted a familiar face, Sandra Mills, head of HR. She gave him a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and then turned quickly away, merging into a sea of sequined dresses and tailored tuxedos. When Brad took the stage, the room fell into a reverent hush. He began announcing the employees who had made outstanding contributions over the year. One by one, names were called: Jordan, Michael, Karen, all people Ethan had trained, coached, or outright saved from catastrophic mistakes. Ethan's heart pounded as the list grew shorter. Surely they hadn't forgotten him? Surely, tonight, the years of late nights, meticulous reports, and quiet fixes would finally be seen. But when the applause ended and Brad stepped down, having honored a parade of golden favorites, Ethan realized his name would never be spoken here. He would always be the intern, even when there was no internship to speak of. Later that night, Ethan found himself at a table near the back, nursing a flat ginger ale while pretending to be absorbed in his phone. Across the room, Brad and his inner circle were clustered around a marble bar, laughing loudly. Ethan caught snatches of their conversation, and his stomach twisted into knots. "Man, these diversity hires are getting ridiculous," one of them chuckled. "Next thing you know, they'll be running the place." Another voice chimed in, dripping with mock concern. "Better teach them how to make coffee first." A wave of heat rose to Ethan's face. He wanted to walk over, to say something, to demand dignity. But he knew how it would go. He would be painted as aggressive, disruptive, and then they'd use it as the perfect excuse to push him out even faster. Instead, he stood quietly, gathering his things, and slipped out into the night air. The chill hit him instantly, but it was nothing compared to the coldness he felt inside. He walked past rows of luxury cars in the valet lot, unnoticed, blending into the darkness like a ghost. As he reached the edge of the hotel's glowing perimeter, he paused and looked back one last time. The party raged on without him, lights flashing, laughter echoing into the night. For them, he was invisible, disposable, forgettable. But what they didn't know, what none of them could ever imagine, was that Ethan King was not just a man they had pushed aside. He was a man with a vision, a patience forged in fire, and a plan quietly taking root. Someday, he promised himself, they would remember his name. Not because he forced them to see him, but because they would have no choice. He tucked his hands into the pockets of his coat, squared his shoulders against the wind, and began walking toward a future none of them saw coming. The Monday following the gala, Ethan returned to the office with a quiet determination burning in his chest. Despite everything, he wasn't ready to give up. If recognition wouldn't come from celebration, then he would force it through results. He poured himself into work, clocking in early before anyone else, and staying long after the lights dimmed. Every report he submitted was flawless, every analysis airtight, every solution both innovative and efficient. His numbers were the best in the department by a wide margin, and slowly, even the people who had once ignored him began to murmur his name when difficult problems arose. Yet, even as Ethan's quiet excellence became impossible to deny, an invisible hand seemed to reach out from the shadows to stifle his every move. Brad Whitmore had noticed too, but not with pride or encouragement. No, Brad saw Ethan's rising reputation as a threat to his carefully curated kingdom of mediocrity and favoritism. When the company launched a highly competitive internal initiative to develop a new predictive analytics tool, Ethan threw himself into it with everything he had. This was his chance, he thought, to finally break through the glass ceiling pressed so tightly against him. For weeks, he worked late into the night, running simulations, designing elegant algorithms, crafting a proposal so airtight that it could have been presented to Fortune 500 executives without a single edit. His project was light years ahead of anything anyone else submitted. He knew it. His teammates knew it. Even the senior managers who sat in on the early reviews knew it. For a brief, shining moment, Ethan allowed himself to hope. The day of the big internal pitch event arrived, and Ethan presented his work with calm precision. The room, packed with executives and team leaders, leaned in, captivated by the scope and clarity of his vision. When he finished, a rare thing happened. The room broke into applause. Genuine applause. Ethan stood there for a moment, heart pounding, daring to believe that finally, the tide had turned. But he should have known better. The very next day, without warning, Brad Whitmore scheduled an all-hands meeting. Standing confidently at the front of the conference room, Brad unveiled his new initiative, the exact same predictive analytics model Ethan had created. Word for word, graph for graph, slide for slide. Brad claimed the innovation was the product of his visionary leadership and hands-on expertise in data solutions. Ethan sat frozen at the back of the room, hands trembling in his lap, as his work, his sweat, his sleepless nights were paraded in front of everyone under someone else's name. The injustice burned through him like acid, but when he approached Brad after the meeting to confront him, Brad just smiled that cold, patronizing smile Ethan had come to loathe. "Teamwork, Ethan," he said smoothly, clapping a heavy hand on Ethan's shoulder. "We all play our part, right?" Ethan stared at him, stunned into silence. He knew deep down that if he pushed harder, if he made a scene, he would be painted as unprofessional, ungrateful, aggressive, the perfect scapegoat. So, for the second time in as many weeks, he swallowed the humiliation and retreated quietly, the taste of bile sharp in his mouth. The betrayal should have broken him, but Ethan steeled himself instead. If they could steal one project, he would simply build another, better, stronger, smarter. Over the following months, he buried himself even deeper into work, producing results so exceptional they couldn't be ignored. Clients praised his reports. Mid-level managers quietly sought his advice. His name began to circulate in whispers of admiration among those who actually understood the technical backbone of the company. For a moment, it seemed the wall was cracking. And then came the second blow. During a Monday morning staff meeting, Brad announced a new elite task force to further develop the predictive analytics platform, the very system stolen from Ethan. It was the most prestigious internal project the company had hosted in years, handpicked by Brad himself. As names were called one by one, Jordan, Karen, Michael, Ethan sat straighter in his seat, confident that this time, finally, his name would be on the list. After all, how could they justify excluding the man who had built the foundation they now sought to expand? But when the last name was called and the room erupted into polite applause, Ethan's heart sank. His name had never been mentioned. He remained glued to his chair, numb, as the others exchanged excited glances and rushed forward to congratulate each other. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight. It was deliberate. Ethan approached Brad after the meeting, his voice calm but strained. "Excuse me," he said, "I noticed I wasn't selected for the task force. I'm curious if there was any feedback about my application?" Brad didn't even bother to mask his disdain. "Ethan," he said with a condescending chuckle, "you're good at what you do. But this project needs a certain chemistry, a cultural fit. You know how important it is for the team to vibe together." He winked, as if sharing some private joke. "No hard feelings, buddy." Ethan stood there, breathing deeply, forcing himself to remain composed. He understood perfectly well what Brad meant by cultural fit. He understood that no matter how brilliant his work was, no matter how loyal or hardworking he remained, he would never be seen as belonging. Not here, not in their world. In that moment, standing in the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway, Ethan realized that merit alone would never be enough. Talent without privilege was invisible here. No applause would come, no reward, no fair fight. The rules had been written long before he arrived, and he had never even been meant to read them. As Ethan walked back to his desk, past the glass offices where the chosen ones were already brainstorming for the new task force, a cold clarity settled over him. They had made a mistake, not in excluding him. No, their true mistake was believing that they had broken him. They thought he would slink away quietly, grateful just to have been allowed to stand near them. But Ethan King was done playing their rig game. He had seen enough. He had learned enough. And somewhere deep within him, a new plan was beginning to take shape. Something bigger. Something far beyond their narrow imaginations. He didn't know exactly how or when, but one thing had crystallized with absolute certainty. If they refused to make room for him at their table, he would build a bigger table, one they would one day have to beg for a seat at. Ethan knew the walls were closing in the moment he stepped into the conference room that Thursday morning, the heavy atmosphere suffocating in a way that had become painfully familiar. After the task force betrayal, he had decided to play the long game, to choose his battles wisely. But today he had an idea, a truly groundbreaking approach to streamline the company's client acquisition process, and it burned inside him with an urgency he couldn't ignore. Maybe, just maybe, if the idea was big enough, undeniable enough, he could force the doors open through sheer brilliance. The meeting kicked off as usual, with Brad Whitmore lounging at the head of the table like a king surveying his court. Ethan sat toward the middle, his notes meticulously organized, heart hammering in his chest. He waited patiently as Brad droned on about quarterly numbers, sprinkled with half-hearted jokes that drew forced laughter from the room. Finally, Brad leaned back in his chair and said with a faux casualness, "All right, any fresh ideas? We need innovation, people." Ethan seized the opportunity, raising his hand slightly, voice steady. "I have a suggestion. he began, outlining a bold, data-driven strategy that would cut onboarding times in half and increase client retention by 20%. Heads around the table began to nod, some executives scribbling notes, eyes lighting up. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt the current shift slightly in his favor. Until Brad interrupted. Hold on, Brad said, laughing as if Ethan had just told a joke. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Streamlining onboarding isn't exactly revolutionary, right? The room tittered nervously. Ethan swallowed, trying to continue, but Brad waved him off with a condescending smirk. Actually, Brad said, sitting up as if struck by sudden genius, what if we approached onboarding like a customer journey experience? Personalized touchpoints, data-driven engagement? It was Ethan's idea, stripped of detail, hollowed out and rebranded in Brad's lazy drawl. Ethan stared at him, momentarily stunned by the audacity. The others looked around awkwardly, but no one spoke up. No one challenged Brad. Why would they? Challenging him was career suicide. So they smiled, nodded, and scribbled notes as if Brad's stolen words were manna from heaven. Ethan sat back, his heart pounding in his ears, realizing once again that in this place, even his voice wasn't his own. If that public humiliation wasn't enough, worse was yet to come. Later that same afternoon, as Ethan sat at his desk reviewing client reports, a notification pinged at the bottom of his screen. A new email thread had exploded across the internal communication system, not meant for him, but accidentally sent to a broader group. With a sinking feeling, he clicked it open. The subject line was harmless enough, Friday happy hour ideas. But inside, buried among casual plans and inside jokes, was a comment from one of Brad's closest lieutenants, a joke about diversity quotas, and how some interns needed to be reminded to stay in their lane. The laughter emojis that followed made it clear it was an inside joke, and Ethan had no doubt who the intern was meant to be. For a moment, he just stared at the screen, the words blurring as rage and humiliation battled for dominance inside him. Around him, the office hummed with casual conversation, oblivious, or worse, willfully ignorant, of the casual cruelty unfolding behind their polished smiles. Ethan thought, for one searing second, about forwarding the email to HR, about demanding accountability. But before he could act, a second notification appeared. It was from Sandra Mills in HR, marked urgent. With a cold, sinking heart, he opened it. Dear Ethan, it began, it has come to our attention that recent incidents in the workplace have caused disruption among team dynamics. Your reactions have been perceived as creating an uncomfortable environment. We would like to schedule a meeting to discuss maintaining a positive workplace culture. Ethan's mouth went dry. They weren't disciplining the people who made the racist jokes. They were blaming him for reacting, for existing, for daring to feel human when treated like less than one. The meeting was scheduled for the next morning. Ethan sat stiffly across from Sandra, who smiled in that tight, corporate way that screamed legal liability. Ethan, she said sweetly, we understand this must be difficult for you. But you have to understand, maintaining team harmony is critical. Sometimes it's better not to escalate things that could be seen as minor misunderstandings. Ethan kept his face blank, even as 1,000 thoughts screamed inside him. Minor misunderstandings. Being reduced to a punchline was a minor misunderstanding. Having your idea stolen was team collaboration. Being excluded from projects was cultural fit. They had taken everything from him, his ideas, his dignity. And now they wanted his silence too. Sandra slid a glossy pamphlet across the table titled Building Resilience in the Workplace, as if that were some kind of bomb. Ethan picked it up, staring at the cheerful stock photo of a diverse team laughing together. A grotesque parody of the world he actually lived in. Sandra's voice softened, coaxing. We really value your presence here, Ethan. We just want to make sure everyone feels comfortable. Ethan nodded slowly, mechanically, knowing full well that the only comfort they cared about was that of the majority. That afternoon, as he walked back to his desk, he noticed the subtle shift in the air, the side glances, the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when he passed. He had been marked, not as a troublemaker exactly, worse, as an outsider. A liability, a problem that needed to be quietly contained or quietly removed. He sat down at his computer, the soft clack of keys around him filling the heavy silence. Outside the window, the sky darkened with an approaching storm. Ethan stared blankly at his monitor, a spreadsheet full of empty cells blinking at him, demanding data he no longer cared about. Somewhere deep inside, the thread that had tethered him to patience, to hope, to the belief that hard work could overcome bigotry, frayed and snapped. He realized, with a clarity that was almost frightening, that he had been fighting the wrong war all along. They would never accept him. They would never reward him. They would never even see him as an equal. The only way forward wasn't through acceptance. It was through power, real, undeniable power. And while they laughed and schemed and stole, he had been learning, watching, calculating. The storm outside was no longer just in the sky. It was building inside him too, a silent, unstoppable force, gathering strength. Ethan King would not be humiliated again. He would make sure of it. After the humiliation he endured in the conference room and the HR meeting that branded him as the problem, Ethan returned to work with a grim understanding that the noose was tightening around him, each move carefully orchestrated to suffocate his future at Whitmore Technologies without ever uttering a single racist word. It began subtly at first, the removal of responsibilities from his plate under the guise of restructuring. Critical reports he once handled were reassigned to junior employees with far less experience, and projects he had spent months nurturing were quietly handed over to others without explanation. When Ethan asked for clarification, he was met with tight-lipped smiles and vague assurances that it was all part of the new workflow strategy. But the message was clear. He was being isolated piece by piece. The final insult came when Brad himself called Ethan into his office one rainy Tuesday morning. The setting was almost laughably cinematic. Brad leaning back in his leather chair, twirling a pen between his fingers, a smug smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Ethan," he said, in a tone so falsely cordial it set Ethan's teeth on edge, "we've decided to move you into a different workspace. Something more fitting for your current role." Ethan blinked, confused. "My current role hasn't changed," he replied carefully. But Brad only chuckled as if Ethan had made a charming, naive comment. "Of course not," Brad said breezily. "It's just better synergy if you're a little closer to the records department. You understand." Without waiting for Ethan's response, Brad handed him a set of keys, small, rusted keys that looked like they belonged to a janitor's closet. The new workspace was on the second sublevel of the building, past the mailroom and across from the maintenance storage. It was a cramped, windowless room with flickering fluorescent lights and a faint smell of mildew seeping from the carpet. A battered metal desk and a worn-out office chair were the only furnishings. Ethan stood in the doorway for a long moment, feeling the weight of the message they had delivered without ever saying a word. He was not part of the team anymore. He was not even part of the company. He was a relic, shoved into a corner to be forgotten until it became convenient to throw him out entirely. The weeks that followed were some of the loneliest Ethan had ever endured. His emails went unanswered. His phone calls were rerouted. Co-workers he had once mentored avoided his gaze in the hallways, suddenly too busy or too uncomfortable to acknowledge him. It was as if he had ceased to exist, a ghost wandering the sterile halls of a company he had helped build. Yet through it all, Ethan refused to break. He came to work every day, dressed in his sharp suits, performing the meaningless tasks they gave him with precision. Every keystroke, every filed report, was an act of quiet defiance. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him unravel. But Brad wasn't content with slow exile. He wanted spectacle. And so, on an otherwise ordinary Friday morning, Brad summoned the entire department to the main conference room for what he described as an important organizational announcement. The mood was electric, employees buzzing with speculation about promotions or restructuring news. Ethan sat near the back, sensing with a gnawing instinct that whatever was coming, it wasn't going to be good for him. Brad took the stage with his usual faux charm, thanking everyone for their hard work and dedication. He talked about the company's future, about streamlining operations, and aligning our workforce with our core values. Then, without warning, he turned to Ethan. "Unfortunately," Brad said, his voice syrupy with false regret, "some individuals, despite their talents, have struggled to fully integrate into the collaborative culture we're building here. It's crucial that every member of our team not only performs, but also fits within the ethos of Whitmore Technologies." There was a beat of silence, a collective intake of breath, and then Brad dropped the axe. "Effective immediately," he announced, "Ethan King will be departing the company." A stunned hush fell over the room. Ethan felt every pair of eyes swing toward him, some wide with shock, others carefully blank, most filled with a mix of pity and silent relief that they weren't the ones being targeted. Ethan rose slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his suit jacket with deliberate precision. He met Brad's gaze across the room, and for the first time, he allowed the cold fury that had been simmering inside him to show in his eyes. Brad smiled in response, a smile of a man who believed he had won, who believed he had finally erased the anomaly that had dared to challenge his manufactured empire. Without a word, Ethan collected his things, what little was left to collect, and walked steadily toward the door. No one moved to stop him. No one whispered words of encouragement. The silence was deafening, a final confirmation that Ethan had always been alone here, fighting a battle no one else had ever intended to win. As he exited the building, the late autumn wind whipping around him, Ethan didn't look back. He didn't need to. He already knew what he was leaving behind, a toxic, decaying structure held together by lies and arrogance. What he didn't know yet, what was still forming in the shadows of his mind, was the future he would build from the ashes they had tried to bury him in. The rain had begun to fall, just as Ethan stepped out of the building that had once held his dreams, now nothing more than a hollow shell in his memory. Fat, heavy drops pelted the concrete, soaking through his suit jacket within minutes. But Ethan didn't hurry. He walked slowly, deliberately, his only possessions a battered leather briefcase in one hand and the steel-hard resolve in his heart. The world around him blurred into gray as he made his way down the street, but inside, Ethan had never seen more clearly. They thought they had stripped him of everything, his position, his dignity, his future. What they didn't realize was that Ethan King had been preparing for this moment far longer than they had been scheming against him. Years ago, when the first cracks had begun to show in Whitmore Technologies' gleaming facade, Ethan had started building a contingency, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. He had seen too many brilliant minds crushed under the heel of mediocrity and prejudice. He had sworn he would not be one of them. Tucked safely within the worn briefcase was more than just a few old documents or a resume of fading hopes. Inside were the blueprints of an empire, the foundation of King Capital, the investment firm Ethan had quietly been constructing over the past 6 years. Every bonus check they begrudgingly gave him, every tax refund, every penny he could spare, he had funneled into carefully chosen stocks, private investments, and shell companies that none of them had ever thought to trace back to him. While they laughed and dismissed him as invisible, Ethan had been weaving a web of silent power, strand by patient strand. The briefcase, with its scuffed leather and frayed seams, carried deeds, shares, confidential agreements, and most importantly, options. Real, tangible options that no one could take away. But even the most meticulous strategist can be blindsided. And Ethan learned just hours after his dismissal that betrayal often wore the most familiar faces. As he sat in the small coffee shop near his apartment, drying out with a cheap cup of black coffee, his phone buzzed with a message from an old colleague, Marcus Shaw, one of the few co-workers Ethan had thought he could trust. They had shared late nights over spreadsheets, exchanged knowing glances during those soul-crushing meetings, bonded over whispered frustrations about Brad and the company's hypocrisy. If there was one person Ethan would have bet on to have his back, it was Marcus. Yet when Ethan opened the attached screenshots sent anonymously through a burner email, his stomach turned. There it was, laid bare, emails between Marcus and Brad, detailed discussions about Ethan's behavior, his so-called incompatibility with the team, sly suggestions that perhaps Ethan's attitude posed a risk to the company's image. Marcus had been the one to feed Brad the ammunition they needed to justify Ethan's public execution. Marcus, who had once raised a glass to Ethan at happy hour and said, "You're the smartest guy here, man," had been stabbing him in the back the whole time. Ethan stared at the screen, feeling not anger, not even sadness, but a cold, clinical detachment. Betrayal was inevitable in a system built on fear and self-preservation. It wasn't personal. It was structural. And it confirmed what he had already decided. He could not save the broken system from within. He would have to replace it. He closed the laptop gently, the rain continuing to pound against the window beside him, and pulled the briefcase closer. Inside, nestled between layers of innocuous-looking documents, was a detailed dossier on Whitmore Technologies' financial vulnerabilities. Over the years, Ethan had noted every shortcoming: their risky debts, their over-leveraged real estate investments, their shaky partnerships with unstable suppliers. He knew where they were exposed. He knew how to hurt them. But he also knew that revenge, for its own sake, was a hollow pursuit. What he wanted wasn't revenge. It was justice. It was to build something better, something stronger, something that didn't need to hide its rot behind polished glass and PR buzzwords. He spent the next several days in a quiet fury of activity, reaching out to old contacts, activating silent partnerships, moving assets into position. King Capital wasn't just an idea anymore. It was a weapon waiting to be wielded. Ethan secured meetings with disillusioned investors, many of whom had grown wary of Whitmore's stagnation but lacked a clear alternative. He gave them an alternative, and he did it with a calm professionalism that masked the storm raging inside him. He didn't beg. He didn't rant. He simply laid out the facts, the risks, the opportunities, the inevitability of change, and let them come to their own conclusions. One by one they did. Each handshake, each signed agreement, was another step away from the man they had tried to erase and closer to the man who would one day stand above them. The irony was not lost on Ethan as he filed paperwork under shell companies designed to look like boutique investment funds. Brad would never even see it coming. He would be too busy congratulating himself on ridding the company of problems, too blinded by his own arrogance to notice the tide pulling out beneath his feet. By the end of the week, Ethan sat alone in his modest apartment, the only light coming from the laptop screen in front of him. The final documents were ready. His briefcase lay open beside him, its contents meticulously organized. 6 years of careful preparation condensed into a single decisive moment. The city stretched out beyond his window, glittering and indifferent. But Ethan's eyes saw something different now. Not obstacles, not barriers, but opportunities. For the first time in a long time, he smiled, a small, quiet smile that held no warmth, only certainty. They had tried to destroy him. Instead, they had forged him into something they could never control. The storm outside had broken now, leaving the streets slick and shining under the streetlights. Ethan stood, closed the briefcase with a decisive click, and slipped on his coat. As he stepped out into the cold night, the briefcase heavy in his hand, he knew the battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The city's skyline glittered under the weight of secrets and ambitions, as Ethan moved silently through the mechanisms he had so carefully set in motion. But while he was orchestrating his quiet revenge, Whitmore Technologies wasted no time in trying to bury his legacy beneath a landslide of ridicule. Barely a week after Ethan's unceremonious exit, the company's internal social network, an insufferably self-congratulatory platform called Whitmore Connect, buzzed with whispered rumors and not-so-subtle jokes at his expense. It began with a single post, anonymous but all too recognizable in tone. A blurry meme of a sinking ship labeled Captain King with the caption, "Guess it's not enough to be loud. You gotta flow too." The post racked up likes and laughing emojis in minutes, emboldening others to pile on. By the end of the day, Whitmore Connect was flooded with inside jokes about Ethan's epic crash, his tragic case of ego inflation, and his status as the intern who thought he was the CEO. Someone even created a fake Ethan's masterclass event offering tips like how to get fired in 3 easy steps and making enemies 101. Ethan didn't need to see it to know it was happening. Former colleagues he had once mentored now gossiped openly, eager to distance themselves from the stain of associating with him. Recruiters who had previously expressed admiration for his work stopped returning his calls. Industry contacts grew mysteriously cold. In their minds, Ethan King had become a parable, a cautionary tale of hubris and failure, a name best forgotten if they wanted to keep their own ambitions intact. It was exactly what Brad and the upper echelons of Whitmore had intended, to salt the earth behind Ethan so thoroughly that no professional future could ever grow there again. But what none of them knew, what none of them even bothered to suspect, was that Ethan had no intention of asking for their acceptance anymore. He wasn't chasing validation. He was building leverage. While the memes circulated and the jokes festered, Ethan was methodically activating the real weapon he had hidden in plain sight, the forgotten stock options and partial ownership rights that Whitmore Technologies had carelessly sold off during a liquidity crisis 3 years earlier. At the time, the company had been desperate to expand their operations and had offered small equity stakes to minor investors under the radar, assuming no serious player would waste time with such scraps. Ethan, recognizing the gold hidden in the debris, had quietly scooped up those microshares through a web of anonymous shell corporations. No one had noticed. No one had cared. Until now. Sitting in a dim corner of an upscale but discreet law office downtown, Ethan watched as his lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Alexis Monroe, slid a series of documents across the polished table toward him. "It's official," Alexis said, her voice carrying the weight of inevitability. "You now control 27% of Whitmore Technologies through proxy holdings. That's more than enough to call for a special shareholder meeting. And with the right leverage, you could push through a leadership challenge." Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing the words like fuel. "And they still have no idea?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Alexis smiled thinly. "Not a clue. They're too busy celebrating your funeral to notice you're digging up their foundations." Outside the window, the rain had stopped, leaving the city gleaming and brittle like shattered glass under the moonlight. Ethan leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin, envisioning the dominoes he was about to topple. They thought he was a failure, a footnote, a joke. They had reduced him to whispers and memes. And yet, while they laughed, he was quietly positioning himself to take everything they had built, their company, their reputations, their illusions of untouchable dominance. Every snide comment, every backhanded joke, every petty meme would serve only to make their eventual fall that much sweeter. The first moves were subtle. Ethan authorized Alexis to begin reaching out to other disgruntled shareholders, offering them attractive buyout deals or strategic partnerships if they shifted their voting power behind King Capital. Many were only too happy to accept. Whitmore's leadership had grown complacent, arrogant, sloppy, and shareholders could smell blood in the water. One by one, the alliances formed, each quiet handshake, each discreet wire transfer pulling Ethan closer to majority influence. It wasn't just revenge anymore, it was inevitability. Meanwhile, back inside Whitmore's ivory tower, Brad Whitmore strutted through the halls like a conquering hero. Word had it he was already drafting new expansion plans, throwing around buzzwords like globalization and next-gen solutions with no real understanding of what they meant. Ethan's departure had emboldened him, convinced him that his empire was stronger than ever, that no one could touch him. Brad even went so far as to mention, during a company-wide webcast, that sometimes pruning dead branches leads to stronger growth, an unsubtle jab at Ethan that drew sycophantic laughter from the crowd. Ethan watched the clip from his apartment that night, a small, unreadable smile playing at the corner of his lips. Let them laugh. Let them believe they had won. It would only make the reveal that much more devastating. As he powered down the laptop, he checked the latest reports from King Capital's silent acquisitions. The numbers looked good. Very good. Within weeks, he would have enough leverage to call an emergency shareholders vote. And when that day came, there would be no warning, no mercy, no possibility for Brad or his cronies to spin the narrative. Their downfall would be public, swift, and absolute. The city outside seemed to hum with the promise of what was to come. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, feeling the magnitude of the moment settle into his bones. Every insult, every slight, every humiliation, they had not broken him. They had honed him. They had given him focus, purpose, clarity sharper than any sword. He opened his eyes, filled with a cold fire that no rumor, no meme, no cowardly whisper could extinguish. It was almost time. Almost. The morning that would change everything began like any other at Whitmore Technologies, with employees bustling through the pristine glass doors, coffee cups in hand, oblivious to the tectonic shift about to upend their world. Brad Whitmore strutted through the building with the cocky assurance of a man convinced he had already won, exchanging smug greetings with the department heads, basking in the invisible crown he believed rested firmly on his head. He had no idea that by the end of the day, that crown would be shattered at his feet. At exactly 9 a.m., a company-wide email pinged into every inbox. Mandatory town hall meeting, 10 a.m. sharp. Attendance required. Speculation rippled through the office like wildfire. Some guessed it was another empty announcement about restructuring or yet another hollow promise of expansion. No one guessed the truth. When the employees filed into the auditorium, the air was thick with the usual buzz of half-bored curiosity. Brad took the stage first, flashing his trademark shark grin, microphone in hand. "Thank you all for being here," he began, voice dripping with false warmth. "Today is an important milestone for Whitmore Technologies. I'm thrilled to announce," but he never got to finish. A tall, stern woman in a charcoal pantsuit, flanked by two sharply dressed men, stepped onto the stage and interrupted him with the authority of a judge passing final sentence. "Mr. Whitmore," she said coolly, her voice carrying through the stunned silence of the auditorium, "please step aside. This announcement is not yours to make." Brad faltered, blinking in confusion, then anger. "Who the hell are you?" he barked. But before he could say more, the large screen behind him flickered to life. Logos shifted, corporate slides vanished, replaced by a single shocking message: Whitmore Technologies, a King Capital company. A gasp swept through the crowd like a physical force. Whispers exploded into full-throated murmuring. Brad turned, gaping at the screen, color draining from his face. "This must be some mistake," he stammered, but the woman cut him off with ruthless efficiency. "There's no mistake, Mr. Whitmore. As of this morning, King Capital has acquired a controlling interest of 71% in Whitmore Technologies through a series of leveraged buyouts and proxy acquisitions. This is a hostile takeover, and it is complete. Effective immediately, Whitmore Technologies is under new ownership." The room erupted into chaos. Some employees shot to their feet, demanding answers. Others sat frozen, stunned into silence. Brad opened and closed his mouth like a fish gasping for air, turning desperately to his CFO, his COO. But they only looked away, pale and shaken. They had seen the writing on the wall too late. Amid the storm of confusion and disbelief, the woman turned back toward the wings of the stage and spoke clearly into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce you to your new CEO." A beat of silence followed, heavy, expectant, vibrating with tension so thick it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. And then Ethan King stepped into the light. For a moment, the entire auditorium seemed to freeze, the collective consciousness of the room trying to reconcile the man they had discarded. The invisible man, the joke, the failed in turn, with a poised, commanding figure now walking toward center stage. Ethan wore a perfectly tailored black suit, the kind that whispered power rather than shouted it. His posture was straight, his shoulders squared, his stride calm and deliberate. There was no trace of bitterness on his face, no gloating smirk, only a cold, focused intensity that radiated authority. His eyes swept the room, impassive, until they locked with Brad's. In that gaze, there was no mercy, no anger. Only fact, a declaration of inevitable supremacy. Brad staggered forward, desperate now. This is insane," he shouted. "You can't do this. You don't have the right." Ethan raised a hand, not to silence him, but because he didn't need to speak over chaos. The room obeyed instinctively, falling quiet, the weight of his presence undeniable. Ethan took the microphone with a calm that made Brad's hysteria look pitiful by comparison. "For years," Ethan began, his voice steady, measured, each syllable landing like a hammer strike, "this company preached values it did not practice. It rewarded mediocrity. It punished integrity. It built walls to keep out the very innovation it claimed to value. And when it could no longer deny the cracks in its foundation, it scapegoated the ones who dared to see it for what it was. He let the silence hang there for a moment, letting the truth settle like dust across the stunned faces before him. Those days are over, Ethan continued. Whitmore Technologies is no longer the domain of the few, the privileged, the entrenched. It belongs to those who build, who innovate, who create value, not those who inherit it by accident of birth. His eyes locked on Brad again, and this time a ghost of a smile flickered across his lips, not of kindness, but of finality. Effective immediately, the previous executive leadership team is relieved of all duties pending review. Interim management will be announced shortly. Details will follow by email. Brad tried to surge forward, veins bulging in his neck, but security guards materialized at either side of the stage, barring his path with professional indifference. The sight of Brad, red-faced, sputtering, powerless, was almost too much for some in the audience, and a few couldn't suppress smirks behind their hands. Ethan didn't spare him another glance. He turned to the audience, speaking once more, his voice even stronger now. Change is difficult, but necessary. For those willing to work with integrity, vision, and courage, there will be opportunity like never before. For those clinging to the old ways, he paused, letting his gaze sweep the room one last time. Your time is up. The applause didn't come immediately. It rose slowly, awkwardly at first, like the cracking of ice, before gathering momentum, until the room was vibrating with the sound of people who knew deep down that they were witnessing something seismic. Ethan stood there for a moment longer, absorbing it all, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his bones. But in his mind he knew, this was just the beginning. The thunder of applause that had begun to build as Ethan stood on stage eventually faded into an expectant hush as he stepped forward once again, his gaze sweeping the faces of a workforce that had once ignored him, mocked him, discarded him. Now they sat rigid in their seats, hanging on every word, every movement, every breath he took. And he intended to make sure they remembered this day forever. There's one more thing you need to understand, Ethan said, his voice low, but carrying effortlessly through the auditorium. This hostile takeover wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It wasn't vengeance. It was strategy, cold, calculated, and inevitable. He paused, allowing the words to sink deep. You see, he continued, stepping to the center of the stage with the fluidity of a man completely in command. Your arrogance, your complacency, your blind faith in your own superiority. Those were the cracks that made this possible. The screen behind him flickered to a new slide, a timeline stretching back 6 years, meticulously detailing every small transaction, every forgotten share sold off to patch temporary financial gaps, every desperate move Brad and his executives had made thinking no one was paying attention. Ethan turned slowly, letting the impact of the evidence settle into the stunned crowd. While you were laughing, he said evenly, while you were mocking, while you were congratulating yourselves for keeping your little world pure, I was buying it out from under you. Another beat of silence. It wasn't difficult, he added almost conversationally. You were so eager to dismiss me that you never considered I might be playing a longer, smarter game. You never even saw me coming. Brad sat frozen near the front row, his mouth slightly open, his fists clenched white against the armrests of his chair. The other executives exchanged frantic, desperate looks, but none dared to speak. Ethan turned his gaze directly to them now, no longer addressing the crowd, but addressing the heart of the rot itself. Your downfall isn't a tragedy, Ethan said, voice hardening, it's justice. It's the natural consequence of your actions, your choices, your character. He let that verdict hang in the air like a blade poised to fall. Effective immediately, Ethan continued, his tone shifting into the cold precision of command. Brad Whitmore and the following executives. He gestured to a scrolling list appearing on the screen, each name striking like a gavel blow, are relieved of all leadership duties. Their contracts are suspended pending investigation into misconduct, dereliction of fiduciary duty, and ethical violations. Gasps rippled through the auditorium as names long considered untouchable fell one after another. Brad leapt to his feet, his voice cracking with rage and panic. You can't do this. I built this company. You're nothing. But a security moved in before he could finish, flanking him with professional indifference. Brad struggled for a moment, then sagged in defeat, the reality crashing down on him heavier than any handcuffs could ever be. Ethan watched impassively as Brad was led from the room, a fallen king deposed by the very man he had once dismissed as invisible. But Ethan wasn't finished yet. He turned back to the remaining employees, many of whom sat stiff with terror, uncertain whether their own names might appear next. For those of you who enabled this culture of exclusion, you have two choices, Ethan said, voice as sharp and final as a guillotine. You will either submit to mandatory retraining in ethics, diversity, and corporate responsibility, or you will resign, effective immediately. A murmur of shock swept through the room, quickly silenced by Ethan's next words. Compliance is not optional. Accountability is not negotiable. Change is not a suggestion. This is the new law of this company. No one moved. No one dared to speak. Ethan knew that some of them resented him, would continue to resent him long after today. That was irrelevant. Fear was a poor motivator. Principle was better. And if they could not find it within themselves to change, they would be replaced by those who could. For those who choose to stay, he added, allowing a softer, but no less commanding tone to creep into his voice, there is opportunity here. Real opportunity. To build a company where merit matters more than privilege, where innovation is valued over appearance, where justice is more than a slogan on a recruitment poster. A few tentative claps broke out at the back of the room, hesitant at first, but quickly gaining momentum until they built into a roar that, while not as deafening as earlier, was sharper, more genuine. These were the people who had chafed under Brad's regime, the ones who had watched in silence, waiting for a chance they thought would never come. Ethan met their eyes and gave a slight nod, a signal that he saw them, that their time had come as well. He stepped back, relinquishing the stage for now, but not the power, that he would hold firmly, wield carefully, and protect fiercely. As the employees filed out of the auditorium, dazed and reeling from the upheaval, Ethan stood alone for a moment, absorbing the weight of what he had just unleashed. Justice was not a clean thing. It was messy, painful, ugly. But it was necessary. And for once, it had been delivered not by the powerful, but by the patient, by the underestimated, by the invisible man who had refused to disappear. The weeks following Ethan King's seismic takeover saw Whitmore Technologies transform from a crumbling empire of entitlement into a proving ground for real merit. But the shift came at a heavy price for those who had once sat comfortably atop the old regime. Brad Whitmore, the self-proclaimed king of the company, found himself stripped not only of title and authority, but of dignity itself. After multiple investigations into his financial mismanagement and ethical violations, Brad was offered a choice: resign and fade into obscurity, or stay and serve under the very system he once corrupted. Humbled to the lowest rung of the corporate ladder, driven by pride too stubborn to accept exile, Brad chose to stay, a decision he would come to regret every single day. No longer the master of his domain, Brad was reassigned as a junior operations assistant, a euphemism for what amounted to little more than office errand boy. His primary task? Managing the executive lounge's coffee service, ensuring that beverages were stocked, machines were cleaned, and refreshments were delivered to the conference rooms on schedule. Every morning, Brad was required to check in at the reception desk, sign a compliance form, and submit his daily work schedule for approval. And the final signature required to authorize his shifts belonged to none other than Ethan King. Each day, Brad trudged into Ethan's sleek, glass-walled office, clutching a clipboard with trembling hands, forced to stand humbly before the man he had once humiliated. Ethan, for his part, treated Brad with the same cold professionalism he offered any employee. No cruelty, no unnecessary words, just a simple nod or an indifferent glance as he signed off on the forms. But to Brad, the indifference was more punishing than open hostility. It was a reminder that he no longer mattered, that he was no longer feared, admired, or even hated. He was invisible, a relic of a discredited past, tolerated only because his fall served as a living warning to anyone who dared cling to the old ways. Word of Brad's fate spread quickly through the company and then beyond, leaked to the press like the scent of blood in water. Industry forums lit up with schadenfreude-laden commentary. Former CEO now brewing coffee, Brad Whitmore's epic fall from grace, the $400 million takeover that changed everything. But Brad was not the only one facing consequences. Those executives and senior managers who had once formed his inner circle, the architects of exclusion, the whisperers of lies, the gatekeepers of opportunity, found themselves similarly undone. Their names, now indelibly associated with the scandal, were blacklisted across the industry. Job offers evaporated. Headhunters stopped calling. Professional networks quietly severed ties. Even the more discreet players could not escape the fallout. Investors, partners, and clients grew wary of anyone even tangentially connected to the toxic culture that Whitmore Technologies had once embodied. One by one, the dominoes fell. A former VP of operations, who had once boasted about his ability to weed out bad cultural fits, saw a lucrative consulting contract rescinded after a background check revealed his role in the scandal. A senior director of marketing, who had circulated some of the cruelest jokes about Ethan on internal platforms, found herself publicly disinvited from an industry leadership summit she had once chaired. Lawsuits began to pile up, wrongful termination claims from other marginalized employees emboldened by Ethan's success, whistleblower complaints unearthing years of buried misconduct, regulatory inquiries into compliance failures. The blowback didn't stop at careers. Personal reputations were shredded. Families faced uncomfortable questions. Friendships strained under the weight of exposed hypocrisy. Those who had once felt untouchable now scrambled for cover, but there was none to be found. Ethan had not sought out this public retribution. He had merely unleashed a force that had been waiting all along, the truth. And truth, once revealed, had a way of consuming everything in its path. In meetings, Ethan watched dispassionately as new executives replaced the old guard, fresh blood eager to prove their worth based on innovation and collaboration rather than pedigree and favoritism. The cultural shift within the company was not easy. Old habits clung like barnacles to a sinking ship. But slowly, steadily, a new foundation was laid. Performance was measured by results, not by connections. Voices that had once been silenced found amplification. Ideas flourished where fear had once reigned. And amid it all, Ethan remained a constant presence, not vengeful, but vigilant, ensuring that the mistakes of the past would never again fester unchecked beneath the surface. Occasionally, Ethan would pass Brad in the hallways, pushing a cart laden with coffee urns and pastry trays, head bowed, eyes averted. Ethan never stopped him, never said a word. He didn't need to. The sight of Brad reduced to a background figure spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. It was not Ethan's approval that Brad sought now. It was something far deeper and more unattainable, redemption. But redemption was not given, it was earned, and Brad had only just begun the long, grueling journey toward it. As Whitmore Technologies slowly emerged from its chrysalis, rebranded and reborn under new leadership and new principles, the echoes of its painful past remained, a necessary reminder of what happens when arrogance blinds justice, when prejudice corrodes merit, when power is wielded not to uplift, but to destroy. Ethan King had not merely won a battle. He had reshaped the battlefield itself. Yet even now, standing atop the empire he had seized, he knew his work was not finished. The seasons shifted, and with them, so too did the story of Whitmore Technologies and the people who had once ruled it with arrogance and disdain. In the months following the hostile takeover, as the new culture of merit and accountability took root, something unexpected began to happen. Among the ruins of broken egos and fallen reputations, seeds of reflection sprouted. For some, like Brad Whitmore, the fall had been particularly brutal, stripping away not only status, but the very illusions that had once shielded him from the consequences of his actions. For a long time, Brad resisted the truth, clinging to bitterness, nursing grievances in silence. But isolation has a way of breaking through the densest walls, and slowly, painfully, Brad began to confront the reality he had spent years denying. It was not a single moment that changed him, but a series of small humiliations. The awkward glances from former allies who now crossed the street to avoid him, the whispered conversations that ceased when he entered a room, the uncomfortable silence that followed him like a shadow. Most of all, it was the realization that he had been the architect of his own downfall, not Ethan King, not the board, not the employees he had once scorned. It was him. That understanding gnawed at him until one cold winter night, sitting alone in his modest apartment, surrounded by the hollow trophies of a past life, Brad did something he never thought he would do. He wrote an apology. The letter was simple, raw, and unadorned by the slick corporate jargon he had once wielded so easily. He acknowledged his actions, the exclusion, the favoritism, the cruelty, and he accepted full responsibility without excuse. He apologized not only to Ethan, but to the countless others he had hurt along the way, knowingly and unknowingly. Most importantly, he promised to do better, not with empty words, but with action. Brad submitted the letter to the company's internal bulletin, allowing every employee to read it, judge it, believe it, or not. But Brad didn't stop there. He reached out to local nonprofits focused on supporting minority entrepreneurs and underserved communities, offering to volunteer his time and business expertise, not as a leader, but as a servant, a student, someone willing to listen and learn. It wasn't penance. It wasn't an attempt to redeem his name. It was the first real act of humility Brad Whitmore had ever performed, and it marked the beginning of a long, uncertain journey toward becoming a better man. Meanwhile, Ethan King continued to reshape not only Whitmore Technologies, but the industry at large. Having proven that change was possible within the walls of a broken institution, Ethan realized that true impact required broader reach. And so, Empower Capital was born. More than just an investment fund, Empower Capital was a mission, a living testament to the belief that talent, drive, and vision exist in every community if given the resources and opportunities to flourish. Ethan dedicated the fund to supporting young entrepreneurs of color, innovators from backgrounds too often overlooked or underestimated by traditional financial systems. Startups, tech firms, green initiatives, education platforms. The portfolio quickly diversified, each investment a new thread in the tapestry Ethan was weaving. But Ethan's vision didn't stop at lifting the next generation. He believed in the power of redemption too, in the idea that even those who had once stood on the wrong side of justice could find a path back to dignity if they chose to walk it sincerely. To that end, Empower Capital also offered programs not just for fresh talent, but for those willing to confront their biases, acknowledge their past wrongs, and commit to building a more equitable future. Ethan did not extend invitations lightly. Redemption had to be earned, not requested. Yet when Brad Whitmore applied, not for funding, but for a place in the volunteer mentorship program, Ethan considered it carefully. Their meeting was private, behind closed doors, without press or fanfare. Brad arrived early, wearing a plain suit, no assistants, no entourage. He sat across from Ethan, the tension thick between them, a heavy silence that neither seemed eager to break. When Brad finally spoke, it was without the bravado that had once defined him. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said simply. "I just want to help undo some of the damage I caused." Ethan studied him for a long moment, searching for signs of performance, of ulterior motive. He found none. What he saw instead was a man stripped bare by failure and willing to rebuild himself from the foundation up. Finally, Ethan nodded once. "You'll start at the bottom," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You'll listen more than you speak. You'll lift others without lifting yourself." Brad accepted the terms without hesitation, and with that, the past was not erased, but a new chapter began. Empower Capital flourished, its impact rippling outward into communities once starved of opportunity. Whitmore Technologies, now rebranded simply as Whitmore King, became a model for inclusive innovation, cited in business journals and case studies as proof that justice and profit were not mutually exclusive. And Ethan King, the once invisible man, became a beacon, not because he had destroyed his enemies, but because he had outgrown them, transcended them, and in doing so, built a future far greater than any one man could claim. In the end, The measure of success was not in the fall of Brad Whitmore or the humiliation of those who had doubted Ethan. It was in the countless lives transformed, the doors opened, the dreams made real because one man had refused to stay invisible. Ethan had not merely reclaimed his dignity. He had rewritten the rules of the game itself, and in doing so, he had proven a truth more powerful than any hostile takeover, any scandal, any fleeting meme. That resilience, vision, and integrity were forces no prejudice could ultimately withstand. If you found Ethan's story as powerful as we did, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more incredible journeys of resilience and redemption. We want to hear from you. What moment in Ethan's rise hit you the hardest? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's talk about it.